Welcome back and congratulations on making it halfway through the course. The last time we met, we discussed Chapter 7, Managing Risks. We described the risk management process, how to identify different kinds of risks, and suggested different approaches for responding to project risks and opportunities. This week, we'll be talking about scheduling resources and costs as a project manager. We've covered Chapters 1 through 7 and Chapter 16. That now leads us to where we are today, which is Chapter 8, Scheduling Resources and Costs. Before we dive right in, let's take a step back a bit. We've learned that, as project managers, we first need to define the project. From there, we can put together time and cost estimates. Again, these are just estimates. We can then develop the project network to understand the tasks which need to be accomplished and how long they might take. Once they are complete, we can finally look at scheduling the resources and the costs for the project. While we have covered the above topics, none of them have dealt with resource usage and availability. The time estimates were made without knowing if resources would be available when they were needed. So let's talk briefly about resource scheduling and costs as they relate to projects. First, a project network is not a schedule until resources have been assigned. Until that happens, it is only an estimated duration. The implicit assumption is that resources will be available in the required amounts when needed. I would guess that most of us have been in a situation where we plan to do something, let's say study for 30 minutes, at a specific time. But when we find that our current task, such as cleaning our room, takes longer and we don't get back to studying until much later than we anticipated. This is how it works with projects. We may assume the designer will be available during this 2-week block, but without actually assigning that resource, it's just an assumption. Along the same line, cost estimates are not a budget until they have been time phased. Just as we need to assign resources to all the tasks, we need to assign costs to the tasks as well. Only then can we have a budget. If resources are adequate, but the demand varies throughout the life of the project, it may be helpful to even out resource demand by using slack to lower peak demand, thus increasing resource utilization. Doing so is called resource smoothing. On the other hand, if resources are not adequate to meet peak demands, the late start of some activities must be delayed, and the duration of the project may be increased. This is called resource-constrained scheduling. Often, project resources are overcommitted, and because resources seldom line up by availability and need, procedures are needed to deal with these problems. We'll take a closer look at the methods used to deal with this issue through resource smoothing and resource-constrained scheduling. We talked about project constraints, or project restrictions, earlier in the semester. They were time, cost, and schedule. In this chapter, we'll be talking about them in a slightly different manner, involving scheduling and cost. First, technical or logical constraints. These constraints are related to the networked sequence in which project activities must occur. With this type of constraint, activity B cannot begin until activity A has been completed due to a technical or logical reasoning. For example, you can't install a faucet until the plumbing has been done. Next, physical constraints. These are activities which cannot be done in parallel or are affected by contractual or environmental conditions. An example of this would be that there is not enough room for 2 or more people to be working in the same location. Then there are resource constraints. These constraints require a particular sequencing of project activities due to the absence, shortage, or unique interrelationship and interaction characteristics of the resources. For example, if there is a shortage of workers to complete 3 tasks at once, the activities would need to be sequenced in a way that would allow the available resources to complete the activities. There are 3 different types of resource constraints. They are people, material, and equipment. As I just mentioned, there are 3 different kinds of resource constraints. There are people. This is the human resource and are typically classified by the skills that they bring to the project. There are materials. What resources are necessary to make, complete, or guide your project? Material availability and shortages have been blamed for the delay of many projects. There is equipment. These are usually presented by type, size, and quantity needed. The most common mistake is assuming the resource pool is adequate for the job. Recognition of equipment constraints before the project begins can avoid high crashing and delay costs. Here are the visual examples of the constraints. Up to now, the start and sequence of activities has been based solely on technical or logical steps, as seen in example A under technical constraints. These networks assume that the people and equipment are available to perform the required work. However, the absence or shortage of resources can drastically change the technical constraints. Parallel activities, as seen in example B under resource constraints, have the potential for resource conflict. This parallel network likely assumes that there is a resource available for each of the parallel tasks. But what if the same resource is responsible for all of these tasks? If that is the case, and only one person will be performing all of these activities, the activities now need to be performed in sequence, as seen in example C under resource constraints. As a result, the duration has now been extended due to lack of resources. Most scheduling methods available today require the project manager to state whether the project is either time-constrained or resource-constrained. If you're the project manager, you'll need to consult your priority matrix to determine which case fits your project. One simple test is to ask, if the critical path is delayed, will resources be added to get back on schedule? If the answer is yes, assume the project is time-constrained. If the answer is no, assume the project is resource-constrained. A time-constrained project is one that must be completed by an imposed date. Time is fixed, resources are flexible. Additional resources are required to ensure the project meets its schedule. A resource-constrained project is one in which the level of resources available cannot be exceeded. Resources are fixed and time is flexible. Inadequate resources will delay the project. The rest of this lecture will depend entirely on the assumptions we're going to discuss now, so please don't skip over this portion. These will be our limiting assumptions. First, splitting activities will not be allowed. Once an activity is started, it will be worked on until it has been completed. Also, the level of resources used for an activity cannot be changed. Please note, these limiting assumptions do not exist in practice, but are used to simplify learning. For risk assumptions, we'll use the following. Activities with the most slack pose the least risk. Reduction of flexibility does not increase risk. And the nature of an activity, easy or complex, doesn't increase risk. Time-constrained projects focus on resource utilization. Remember, when a project is time-constrained, the project must be completed by the imposed date. It is difficult to manage a schedule when resource availability is erratic. Therefore, project managers typically resolve this by using resource leveling, a technique used to balance or smooth resource demand. Leveling basically delays non-critical activities, using slack to reduce peak demand. When the resource demand leveling technique is used, it provides the following benefits for the project. Peak resource demands are reduced. Resources over the life of the project are reduced. Fluctuation in resource demand is minimized. However, it also has a couple disadvantages for the project. A loss of flexibility that occurs from reducing slack, and increases in the criticality of all activities. Resource-constrained projects occur when the number of people and/or equipment is not adequate to meet peak demand requirements, and it is impossible to obtain more. Resources are limited in quantity or availability. The activities are scheduled using heuristics, or rule of thumb, that focuses on activities having 1. Minimum slack, 2. The smallest or least duration, and 3. Lowest activity identification number. Heuristics is applied by using the parallel method, an iterative process starting with the first time period and scheduling the start of activities period by period by using the 3-priority rule discussed above. Let's walk through how the parallel method works. Here's a project network, an example from the textbook. The dashed nodes represent the critical path. Keep this image in mind as we continue the example on the next slide. Here's the resource loading chart for the project network we just saw. The shaded areas represent the scheduling intervals of the time-constrained schedule, early start through late finish. Just a quick side note, I'd like to point out the early start column and the late finish column. You can see on what day each particular activity has their early start and what day each particular activity has their late finish. Those dates are then plotted out on the chart and shaded as you see here. Also note the column with heading RES, which stands for resources. This is the number of resources available for each activity. Now you can schedule the resources any place within the interval or shaded area and not delay the project. Scheduling the activity beyond the late finish or past the shaded area will delay the project. In the last slide, we looked at the duration, early start, late finish, and resource column. Now let's add in a column for slack and look at the bottom two rows, total resource load and resource available. The total resource load row shows you the number of people scheduled to work for that period, while the resource available row tells you the maximum number of resources you can schedule during that period. Now let's take a look at how this progresses. Periods 0 through 1 and 1 to 2 both have 2 resources for each period, so the resources have been allocated here. From periods 2 to 3, activities 2, 3, and 4 are eligible to be scheduled. Activity 3 has the least slack, 0, so apply Rule 1, which is minimum slack. Load Activity 3 into the schedule. Activity 2 is next with slack of 2. However, Activity 2 requires 2 programmers and only 1 is available. So, let's delay Activity 2 and update the early start to 3 and slack to 1. The next eligible activity is Activity 4, since it only requires 1 programmer. We load Activity 4 into the schedule. Continuing on, in period 3 to 4, Activity 2 is eligible, but exceeds the limit of 3 programmers available. So we delay Activity 2 and update the early start to 4 and slack to 0. In period 4 to 5, Activity 2 is eligible again to be scheduled, but still exceeds the limit of 3 programmers. Again, we delay Activity 2 and update the early start to 5, the late finish to 11, and slack to -1. We delay Activity 7 as well and update the early start to 11, late finish to 13, and slack to -1. In period 5 to 6, Activity 2 is once again eligible, but still exceeds the limit of 3 programmers. So we delay the activity and update early start to 6, late finish to 12, and slack to -2. We also delay Activity 7 and update the early start to 12, late finish to 14, and slack to -2. Activities 2, 4, and 6 are eligible with slack of -2, 2, and 0 respectively. Load Activity 2 into the schedule per Rule 1, which again is minimum slack. Because Activity 6 has 0 slack, it is the next eligible activity. Load Activity 6 into the schedule, again using Rule 1. The programmer limit of 3 has been reached, so we delay Activity 5 and update early start to 7 and slack to 1. For periods 7 to 8, the limit is reached. There are no programmers available. Therefore, delay Activity 5 and update early start to 8 and slack to 0. Period 8 to 9 has its resource limit met. So we delay Activity 5 and update early start to 9, late finish to 11, and slack to -1. Period 9 to 10 has also reached its resource limit. So we delay Activity 5 and update the early start to 10, late finish to 12, and slack to -2. Activity 5 is eligible during period 10 to 11, so let's load Activity 5 into the schedule. Note here that Activity 6 does not have slack because there are no programmers available. Remember, 3 is the max. For period 11 to 12, there are no eligible activities. For period 12 to 13, Activity 7 is eligible, so let's load it into the schedule. When we used the parallel scheduling method, the project duration changed to 14 time units, rather than the time-constrained project duration of 12 time units. This is the revised network reflecting the new start, finish, and slack times for each activity. Note that Activity 6 is still critical and has a slack of 0 time units because no resources are available. They're being used for Activities 3 and 5. If you compare the two networks, you'll see that the slack has been reduced significantly in the resource-constrained project. Also note that the number of critical activities, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7, has increased from 4 to 6. By leveling or smoothing programming needs, each period of the project no longer exceeded the 3 available programmers for the project. Therefore, the goal of resource smoothing was achieved. Like leveling schedules, the limited resource schedule usually reduces the delay, but it also reduces flexibility. It increases the criticality of events and scheduling complexity. It may make the traditional critical path no longer meaningful due to the concept of sequential activities from the start to the end of the project. The constraints can break the sequence and leave the network with a set of disjointed critical events. Conversely, parallel activities can become sequential. Activities with slack on a time-constraint network can change from critical to non-critical. Splitting is a scheduling technique used to obtain a better project schedule, but has a downside in that it can also increase resource utilization. It involves interrupting work on an activity to use the resource on another activity, then returning the resource to finish the interrupted work. This is possible only when startup and shutdown costs are low. However, it's also considered the major reason why projects fail to meet schedule objectives. Let's take a look at how splitting works. The top image shows an activity duration without splitting, or in other words, when the resource works on the activity straight through from start to finish. The second image shows the same activity, only broken into 3 separate activities: Activity A, Activity B, and Activity C. You can see that splitting this activity does not lengthen the duration of the activity. The last image demonstrates the most common mistake in splitting, doing so when startup and shutdown costs are not low. Here, we've added in the amount of time for startup and shutdown after and before the next portion of the activity resumes. You can see that in doing so, we have lengthened the activity duration. Schedulers and planners should avoid splitting activities as much as possible except when there's no alternative for resolving a scarce resource problem, and/or costs of splitting are known to be small and insignificant to the project. There are several benefits to using scheduling resources. Schedules should be created before the project begins to allow time for consideration of reasonable alternatives, such as cost-time trade-offs and changes in priorities. It also provides information for time-phased work project budgets to assess the impact of unforeseen events and the amount of flexibility in available resources. If a project is truly dealing with limited or scarce resources, the schedule will end up being a resource-constrained schedule, not time-constrained. When you have multiple projects occurring at one time, there are problems to be aware of. First, be aware of overall project slippage. A delay on one project creates delays for other projects. Also, inefficient resource application. The ups and downs of resource demands create scheduling problems and delays for projects. You may also find yourself with resource bottlenecks. Shortages of critical resources required for multiple projects cause delays and schedule extensions. There are ways to manage multi-project schedules. Many companies are creating project offices, PMOs, or specific departments to oversee resource scheduling across multiple projects. The project offices or departments can then utilize a project priority queuing system or first come first served for resources. They can centralize project management, where they treat all projects as part of a mega project. Another option is to outsource projects to reduce the number of projects handled internally. Creating a time-phased budget baseline is necessary to determine if the project is on, ahead, or behind schedule and over or under its budgeted costs. It helps the project manager to know how much work has been accomplished for the allocated money spent, the project cost baseline. To create a time-based budget, you will assign each work package to one responsible person or department and deliverable. You then compare the planned schedule and costs using an integrative system called earned value. Let's take a look at an example using the time-phased budget baseline. For this example, you are developing a new product which will be completed in 10 weeks at an estimated cost of $400,000 per week for a total project cost of $4 million. At the 5-week period, or halfway through the project, you receive a status report with the following information. Planned costs for the first 5 weeks are $2 million, and the actual cost for this period of time is $1.7 million. This raises a couple of questions. 1. Is the project costing $300,000 less than expected? Or 2. Is the project running behind schedule and $300,000 worth of work has not yet been started? We can't tell just by looking at this data. There is no way to be certain how much of the physical work has been accomplished. Without time phasing costs to match your project schedule, it is impossible to have reliable information for control purposes. Here's a work package with a duration of 3 weeks. If we assume labor, materials, and equipment are tracked separately, the work package costs for labor are distributed over the 3 weeks as they are expected to occur. When the 3-week work package is placed in the network schedule, the costs are distributed to the time-phased budget for the same 3 scheduled weeks. A time-phased budget for each work package is lifted from the work breakdown structure and placed in the schedule as they are expected to occur. The result of this budget allocation is the project cost baseline, also known as planned value or PV. Planned value is used to determine costs and schedule variance from the original plan as the project progresses. It is the sum of all the cost accounts, each cost account the sum of the work packages in the cost account. This time-phased labor budget for 2 work packages are budgeted across work periods. It shows the cost for the programmer's labor over periods 1, 2, and 3, and also shows the cost for the system programmer's labor for periods 3 and 4. They are then totaled across the periods and down for a complete labor total. The top part of this image is a resource profile showing the number of resources available over the 14 work periods. You can see how the time-phased work package costs were placed into the network and how the cumulative project budget graph for the project is developed. Over time, as the project is worked, the planned value accumulates as each phase is completed. The bottom portion with the graph illustrates this accumulation. Notice that costs do not have to be distributed linearly, but the costs should be placed as you expect them to occur. Now that a time-phased budget baseline has been established, the planned schedule and planned costs can be compared to the actual schedule and actual costs. Remember, if your budget costs are not time-phased, there is really no reliable way to measure performance. We've spent the last 20 minutes or so discussing the issue of scheduling resources and costs as they pertain to project management. We talked about the differences between time and resource-constrained projects, the implications for managing time and resource-constrained projects, and introduced multi-project resource scheduling. Next week, I will post a very brief PowerPoint with lecture covering Chapter 9, Reducing Project Duration. There will be some new content, but it should mostly be review and tying concepts together. You will be responsible for all the information in this chapter as it will be on the next quiz. In addition to the brief lecture on Chapter 9, I'll also be posting a lecture for Chapter 10, Leadership, Being an Effective Project Manager. This will include information regarding the importance of building trust and the qualities of an effective project manager. As always, if you have any questions or concerns regarding the content covered here or during any part of the course, please do not hesitate to contact me. And if you've changed your mind regarding the study group, please let me know. I'm happy to connect you with one of the established groups. Now, head on over to Blackboard to respond to this week's discussions. Remember, these are not optional. Have a great week.